Hey, bookworms. Welcome back to the Book Nook podcast. Yeah. Today, we're going to be doing a deep dive into On Tyranny.
On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century by Timothy Snyder.
Yeah, exactly. You know, I was so fascinated when I started looking into this because there's like two different formats.
Yeah, you have the original, which is really powerful.
Right.
And then Nora Krug illustrated this graphic novel adaptation.
It's like having two different lenses to look at this incredibly important message.
And it is. I mean, you know, we've got a couple different sources here that we're looking at. We've got the book itself, obviously. We've got a book review. And one of the things that the book review actually frames this as is a guidebook for the time of Trump.
Ooh,
which, you know,
that's intense.
It's a pretty intense way to frame it.
Yeah, I was going to say, before we go any further, I do want to just put out there to our listeners that we're not endorsing any particular political viewpoint.
No, not at all.
We're just exploring the idea.
Exploring what is in these different sources. So.
Right, yeah. So Timothy Snyder, he doesn't actually say that America is on the brink of dictatorship, but he does offer this warning, and I think it's a very stark one. Okay. And it's right at the start of the book. Americans today are no wiser than the Europeans who saw democracy yield to fascism, Nazism, or communism in the 20th century. Now is a good time to do so.
Wow, that's a wake-up call.
And that's coming from Timothy Snyder. You know, he's a historian.
Yeah.
He specializes in 20th century European tyranny.
Yeah, and actually Bloodlands, the book that he wrote.
Oh, fantastic.
That is just a deeply, deeply researched account of the horrors of totalitarian regime.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, when he talks about the patterns of tyranny, you know he's not...
Yeah, he's not messing around.
Yeah, exactly. He's speaking from this place of deep knowledge and understanding. So he starts off, his very first lesson is, do not obey in advance.
Okay, so break that down for me a little bit.
So the idea here is that authoritarians, they gain power because people passively accept that their freedoms are eroding. It's like we anticipate and just like obey orders before they're even given.
Yes, it's this anticipatory obedience.
Wow.
You know, he uses the example of Austrians in 1938, just sort of passively accepting Nazi rule.
Which is chilling.
Very chilling example of how easily people can just kind of fall into that trap.
But isn't that kind of a simplified view of history? Because I was looking at the book review and they pushed back a little bit on that, saying that history is full of examples of people resisting, even in the most extreme situation.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, think about Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat on the bus.
Yeah.
Or people who hid Jewish families during the Holocaust, risking their lives to help others.
That is inspiring.
Very much so.
Yeah.
And I think those acts of courage really do remind us that resistance is possible.
Even when it feels hopeless.
Absolutely. Even when the odds are stacked against us.
Yeah, it gives me hope.
Me too.
It really does. You know, it just makes you wonder, what would we do? You know, what would we as a society do? What would I as an individual do?
It is a great question, you know. Are we as individuals and a society more likely to obey or to resist when faced with that threat?
I don't know. I mean...
It's something to think about.
Yeah, I think we all have to think about that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And, you know, it's not just about these grand acts of defiance, right? Like, Snyder talks a lot about these everyday acts of resistance.
He does.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Well, you know, he's a big proponent of being kind to language.
What does that even mean?
So he means being mindful of the words that we use and making sure that we're not perpetuating narratives that are harmful.
That feels really relevant today, especially when you think about...
Oh, with social media, the internet.
All the misinformation and the propaganda.
Yes, exactly. And it spreads so quickly.
Yeah.
You know, he warns against what he calls the politics of eternity.
Politics of eternity.
Where facts are denied and they're replaced by emotionally charged narratives.
We see that all the time.
We do see that all the time. You know, you'll see politicians, you'll see media outlets making claims.
Yeah.
And they are so easily debunked.
Right.
But their supporters, they just believe it wholeheartedly.
Because it fits their worldview.
Because it fits their worldview. Exactly. It's like we're living in different realities.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And you know what? He connects that denial of facts to the rise of fascism.
Wow.
He even points to that surge in sales of 1984.
Oh, yeah.
As a reflection of, you know, people's anxieties.
Yeah.
About truth being eroded.
It's just crazy because that book was written decades ago.
I know.
And it feels so relevant today.
It's a reminder that these threats, they're not new. They just take on different forms.
Exactly.
So moving on to lesson number 2.
Okay.
Defend institutions.
Okay.
So he sees these institutions, things like our courts, the press, trade unions, these are the pillars.
Right.
of a functioning democracy.
If we don't protect those, then
we're in trouble. He even uses this example of Jewish newspaper. In 1933, they were downplaying the Nazi threat.
Oh, wow.
To highlight the danger of complacency.
Yeah, it's like if we don't protect the systems that are meant to safeguard our rights, then
those rights go away.
Then we lose them.
And the book review that we were talking about before, they actually they complicate this a little bit.
How so?
Because they argue that some people voted for Trump because they felt those institutions had failed them.
Right, so it's like a catch-22. We have to defend them, but they have to be worthy of being defended.
You've got to rebuild that public trust. And they use the example of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, saying that some voters felt like, they weren't actually doing a good job of protecting the environment.
Right, which then leads to distrust.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So there's got to be that reform.
Reform for maintaining that trust.
Absolutely.
Okay, that makes sense. And, it makes me think of his point about the one-party state.
Yes.
Which, hold on. Before we go any further, I do want to just remind our amazing listeners to subscribe to the Book Nook podcast.
Yes, please.
And leave us a review.
Leave us a review.
If you're enjoying this deep dive.
If you're liking what you're hearing.
Yes, your feedback means the world to us.
Absolutely.
Okay, now we can get back to the one-party state.
Okay.
So I was going to say, it's interesting because, obviously America has a two-party system.
Right.
But even with that.
Right.
He says there's a lot of issues.
He does. He points to the influence of money in politics, gerrymandering, and then the lack of secure voting systems.
Like paper ballots, I think he talks about?
Paper ballots, yeah. And he argues that these things can create a situation where one party holds way too much power.
Right.
Even when there's technically another party there.
So it's like this illusion of choice.
Right, exactly.
The outcome is kind of already predetermined, yeah.
And the book review agrees. They argue that, that the U.S. is basically a two-party version of a one-party state.
Because of the corporate funding, right?
Yes, the corporate funding.
Yeah.
They both kind of end up serving their wealthy donors.
Yeah, and then everyday citizens feel
powerless. Exactly. So the needs of the people are just sidelined in favor of these corporate interests.
So what do we do? Because Snyder's not just like doom and gloom.
Right.
He's got to...
No, he actually gives some very practical advice.
Okay, like what?
Like advocating for campaign finance reform.
Okay.
And pushing for secure voting systems.
So we can level the playing field.
Level the playing field and make sure that our democracy represents the will of the people.
That's empowering. Yeah. It's not just like, oh, there's a problem, but he's like, here's something you can do.
Here's some solutions.
Yeah.
And he's got more, and I think you're going to find this next lesson particularly relevant.
Ooh, a cliffhanger. Well, guess our listeners will have to tune into part 2 to hear what that lesson is.
All right, so remember how I left you hanging with that cliffhanger?
Oh, yes. I'm very curious.
So Snyder's next lesson is take responsibility for the face of the world.
The face of the world. Okay, that sounds pretty deep. Like, what does that even mean?
So he's talking about symbols and imagery that we use to represent our values and beliefs.
Okay.
Things like flags, monuments, even online avatars.
So it's about being mindful of the messages that we're putting out there.
Exactly, both consciously and unconsciously. And he argues that, authoritarian regimes, they often manipulate these symbols to create a false sense of unity.
Right, like think about those totalitarian regimes where you see the leader's face everywhere.
Yes.
Like it's
a cult of personality.
Yeah.
Exactly. So he's encouraging us to be critical of these images, to question their meaning and intent, and to create our own symbols that represent the values that we hold dear.
So it's not just about tearing down the oppressive symbols. It's about
creating new ones.
Creating new ones, yeah, that embody like
hope, justice, freedom.
Freedom, yeah.
It's about taking ownership.
I like that.
Of the visual landscape of our world.
And shaping it.
Shaping it to what we want to see.
It's like we have the power to rewrite the visual narrative of our time.
Absolutely. And he reminds us that this is ongoing.
Right.
It's constantly evolving, so.
We have to keep at it.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, that was a lot to unpack. Before we go any further, I want to remind our listeners once again to subscribe to the Book Nook podcast.
Please do.
And leave us a review. We love hearing your thoughts.
Yes, we do.
Okay, back to Snyder. What other lessons did he have for us?
So he talks about remembering professional ethics.
Interesting. What does he mean by that? Because I always think of professional ethics as like workplace conduct.
Well, they are, but he's arguing that they have this broader societal significance.
It's curious. How so?
Well, he believes that when professionals compromise their ethical standards,
Okay.
it erodes trust in those institutions, and it creates an environment where tyranny can thrive.
So like doctors, lawyers, journalists.
Yeah, educators, if we can't trust those people,
Yeah,
then
who can we trust?
exactly. So he's encouraging professionals to resist those pressures to conform.
Even when it could hurt their career.
Yes, even when it could jeopardize their careers.
That takes a lot of courage.
It does, but he reminds us that those acts of individual courage can inspire others
Oh, okay.
and help create that culture of accountability.
So it's about setting an example.
It is about setting an example, yeah, and recognizing that our actions,
Of consequences?
they shape the fabric of our society.
Right. It's bigger than just us.
Absolutely.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So what else does he have to say about resisting tyranny?
So he talks about be kind to our language.
Wait, I think we already talked about that, didn't we? Like being mindful of the words that we use.
Yes, but this goes a little deeper. He's arguing that the way we use language shapes our thinking
Okay.
and our ability to resist oppression.
How so?
Well, he points out that totalitarian regimes, they distort and manipulate language to control people.
Right, like using nice-sounding words to cover up really awful things.
Yes, euphemisms. Think about ethnic cleansing,
Right.
re-education camps. These are deliberate attempts.
To soften it.
Yes, to soften the violence and oppression. So he's encouraging us to use language thoughtfully.
Precise.
To avoid cliches, slogans, things that stifle critical thinking.
So it's about really being an active participant in the meaning of words.
Absolutely. And he believes that language, it's a powerful tool.
Yeah, for good and bad.
For both oppression and liberation, yeah.
Up to us.
Yes, how we use it.
Powerful message. It reminds me of that quote, the pen is mightier than the sword.
Absolutely. Words have so much power to inspire, to challenge, to create change.
So we've talked about defending institutions, being mindful of symbols, upholding those professional ethics, and using language carefully. What else, what other lessons stood out to you?
So he talks about the importance of investigating.
Investigating. Like being a detective.
Kind of, yeah.
Okay.
He means being curious, asking questions, especially when things don't seem right.
Okay.
And he reminds us that tyrants thrive in an environment of secrecy,
Right.
misinformation, so it's about being skeptical.
Oh.
Challenging those assumptions and seeking out the truth.
And investigating our own biases, right?
Absolutely. We all have blind spots.
For sure.
So being willing to examine our own assumptions.
And be open to new information.
Yeah, exactly. He encourages us to be lifelong learners, to seek out diverse perspectives.
Be willing to change our minds.
Yeah, when presented with new evidence.
That's a tough one, but an important one.
It is. It is. So, it's not about blindly accepting everything we're told. It's about being critical thinkers.
Yeah, actively seeking out the truth.
Exactly.
Okay, another really thought-provoking lesson. I'm starting to see how all of these ideas kind of connect.
Yeah, they do. They all kind of weave together.
To create this roadmap.
It is like a roadmap for resisting tyranny in all its forms.
And it's an ongoing journey, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
it is. It's not a destination.
It's not like we get to freedom and then we're done.
No. It's about constant vigilance and, he reminds us we don't have to do this alone.
There are others out there fighting the good fight.
Absolutely. There are countless others who share those values and are working to create a better world.
It's about finding those people, creating those coalitions.
Yes.
Supporting each other.
Yeah. And even small acts of resistance can have a ripple effect.
Right, that butterfly effect.
Exactly.
One small thing can make a big difference.
Yeah. So by combining our efforts...
we can make real change.
Exactly.
So it's about recognizing that we all have a role to play.
We do, no matter how small.
Yeah.
And to never give up hope.
That's important, that hope.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. So after all this, after this deep dive into On Tyranny, what's your biggest takeaway for our listeners?
Well, I hope they remember that they're not alone.
Yes.
That there are others out there, like I said, who share their values and are working towards that
that more equitable world.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And also that they have the power to make a difference.
Even in small ways.
Even in small ways, yeah.
Because it all adds up.
It all adds up. Every act of resistance, every voice that's raised against injustice.
Yeah. It contributes to the whole...
It does.
That collective effort.
To create that better future.
And that's a hopeful message.
It is a hopeful message, yeah. Especially, in these kind of uncertain times that we live in.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today, exploring the insights and the lessons from Timothy Snyder's On Tyranny.
It's a powerful book.
It has been a fascinating conversation.
It has, and I encourage our listeners.
Yes, check out the book for themselves.
Yeah, On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century.
It's a must-read, especially if you care about the future of democracy.
Absolutely.
And before we jump into that idea of corporeal politics, I wanted to remind our listeners once again,
one last time,
to subscribe to the Book Nook podcast and leave us a review. We really appreciate your support. Now, back to On Tyranny and that idea of corporeal politics. What exactly does Snyder mean by that?
Well, it's about, taking our resistance beyond the digital world and into the physical realm.
Okay.
It's about showing up in person.
So like protests, rallies.
Exactly. Volunteering for organizations, participating in community events, or even just having those face-to-face conversations with people who have different viewpoints.
So it's about like putting our bodies where our beliefs are.
Yes. Not just talking the talk, but walking the walk, right?
Yeah.
And he believes that this physical engagement is crucial for building solidarity. Fostering empathy, creating lasting change.
So it's not enough to just post on social media or sign online petitions?
Those things can be important.
Right.
But he argues that they can create a false sense of accomplishment.
Yeah, like you've done your part, but you haven't really.
No, real change requires us to step outside our comfort zones and engage with the world in a tangible way.
So it's about showing up.
Showing up. Again and again, even when it's difficult.
Even when it feels like we're not making a difference.
And recognizing that we don't have to do it alone.
Right, like finding our tribe.
Finding our tribe, exactly. And maybe inspiring others to join us.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, another lesson that really resonated with me was his advice to establish a private life.
Ooh, okay. That sounds kind of unexpected. What does he mean by that?
So he's talking about creating a space in our lives that is separate from the constant barrage of information.
So like unplugging?
Unplugging, spending time in nature, pursuing hobbies.
It's like getting away from it all.
Yes, exactly. Giving ourselves time and space for reflection, connecting with our loved ones, and just being ourselves without the pressure to perform or conform.
Like recharging our battery.
Yes, recharging those batteries. And he believes that, a strong private life is essential for maintaining our mental and emotional well-being.
Right. You can't pour from an empty cup.
You cannot pour from an empty cup.
Yeah.
And that gives us the strength to resist tyranny in all its forms.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. You got to take care of yourself.
You do.
So you can take care of the world.
And his very last lesson is, be as courageous as you can.
That seems like a very fitting lesson after all of this.
Yeah, it's a reminder that it's not always easy resisting tyranny.
Right.
It takes courage to stand up for what's right, to speak truth to power, to challenge the status quo.
And it can be really intimidating, especially when you feel like you're up against these huge forces.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But he reminds us that even those small acts of courage, they can have that ripple effect.
Right, like we were talking about before.
Exactly, inspiring others to find their own courage, and together we can create a wave of change.
So it's about finding that inner strength, that spark of defiance.
Yeah, using it.
To make a difference.
Exactly.
Yeah. And courage isn't the absence of fear, right?
No, it's the willingness to act despite that fear.
Yeah, fear's normal.
Oh, yeah. It's a natural human emotion, but we don't have to let it control us.
Exactly. So after this deep dive into On Tyranny, what's your biggest takeaway?
I hope our listeners will remember that they're not alone in this fight.
That's important.
There are so many others who share their values and are working towards a more just and equitable world.
It's about finding those people.
Finding those people, connecting with them, supporting each other.
And knowing that you have the power.
You do have the power, even in small ways.
Because every act of resistance, every voice raised against injustice, it all matters.
It does. It all contributes to that collective effort to create a better future.
And that's a hopeful message.
It is.
Yeah. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today with On Tyranny. This has been a fascinating conversation.
It has.
And I would encourage our listeners to check out the book for themselves.
Yes, On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century.
It's a must-read, especially if you care about the future of democracy.
Absolutely.
And don't forget to subscribe to the Book Nook podcast and leave us a review. We love hearing from you. And if you want to get your own copy of On Tyranny, check the link in our show notes.
Thanks for listening.
Until next time, happy reading.